the Bloomkeeper's daughter. The garden was alive in ways words could scarcely hold. Beneath the sprawling boughs of elder oaks, where ivy wove through the roots like nature's veins, Elena grew up among the blooms. She knew every corner of the garden's labyrinthine paths and every flower that graced its verdant expanse. Yet, for all its familiarity, the place felt endlessly mysterious, as if it pulsed with secrets she could never quite grasp. Her father, Tormund, tended the garden as though it were a cathedral, his rough hands performing acts of quiet devotion. Each morning, he would kneel beside a patch of violets or lilies, murmuring under his breath in a language Elena did not know. She watched him sometimes from the window of their weathered cottage, noting the solemnity in his movements, the reverence in his touch. His gardening was no mere chore. It was ritual, sacred and strange. The garden's beauty was unearthly. Roses bloomed redder than blood, their petals velvety and perfect. Orchids of deep indigo seemed to shimmer as though dusted with stardust. Lavender released a fragrance so potent that it lingered in the air long after the sun had set. But the most remarkable thing was how the garden seemed to hum, not loudly, and not in a way anyone else might notice, but Elena felt it. A faint vibration beneath her feet, a resonance that stirred her heart. Her father never spoke of the garden's peculiarities. When she asked why the flowers bloomed year-round, or why their colors seemed to shift with the light, Tormund would simply say, "The garden is what it is. No more, no less." And if she pressed further, he'd fix her with a gaze so piercing it silenced her questions. But Elena was not the sort to leave mysteries untouched. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of amethyst and amber, Elena wandered the garden paths, feeling the hum grow stronger with each step. She passed rows of sunflowers that seemed to lean toward her, their golden faces glowing in the dim light. Then she heard it. A sigh. A long, mournful sound that seemed to come from the heart of the garden. "Father?" she called. But the only answer was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Drawn by an unseen force, she moved deeper into the garden, to a place she had never been. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the hum became a thrumming beat in her chest. She turned a corner and stopped. Before her stood a gate she'd never seen before, its iron lattice entwined with golden vines. The vines seemed alive, shifting subtly, their leaves catching and reflecting the last rays of the sun. Elena reached out to touch the gate, but a hand grasped her wrist before she could. She turned to find her father behind her, his face shadowed, his eyes burning with something between anger and fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and edged with warning. "I didn't mean to," she began, but he cut her off. "This is not a place for you, Elena. Not yet." His grip loosened, but the intensity in his eyes pinned her in place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the garden seemed louder now, almost deafening in the silence between them. "What's beyond the gate?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. Tormund's gaze flicked to the golden vines, then back to her. "A field," he said at last, a field where no one but the Bloomkeeper may go. Who is the Bloomkeeper? Elena pressed, her curiosity flaring. His expression darkened, and he turned away. Enough questions for one day. He began to walk back toward the cottage, leaving her alone with the gate. Elena lingered, staring at the golden vines that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive. The garden sighed again, a sound so sorrowful it sent a shiver down her spine. Whatever lay beyond the gate, she knew it was more than just a field. And she knew that the garden, with all its hums and sighs, was not just a garden. It was something far greater, and she was bound to it in ways she was only beginning to understand. The garden seemed to hold its breath after that evening, its vibrant energy dulled as if in mourning. The hum, once constant and comforting, wavered with an unsettling rhythm. Elena felt it even in her dreams, a pulsing beat that resonated with the same unease she carried during the waking hours. She couldn't forget the gate, or the look in her father's eyes when he spoke of the Bloomkeeper. It wasn't anger she had seen, not truly. It was fear. One morning, the garden greeted her with a strange new bloom. Near the southern edge, where the lavender and marigolds usually thrived, there stood a single black orchid, its petals streaked with crimson veins. It seemed out of place, a jarring presence amidst the gentle harmony of the other flowers. Elena knelt to examine it, feeling the faint hum intensify as her fingers hovered near the bloom. It wasn't like the others. This flower pulsed, alive in a way that made her both awed and uneasy. "Don't touch it." Her father's voice startled her. He stood behind her, his face etched with worry. Elena straightened, her hand withdrawing reluctantly. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the orchid as though it might spring to life and lash out. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "A bloom of sorrow. It appears when a soul is in turmoil." Elena frowned. "A soul? What do you mean?" Tormund sighed and gestured for her to follow him. They walked in silence through the winding paths of the garden until they reached the oak bench near the center. Here, surrounded by the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft hum of flowers, Tormund began to speak. "This garden isn't just a garden, Elena. It's a keeper of life. Every flower you see is connected to a soul, a living essence bound to this place. The colors, the blooms, the way they shift and sway, they reflect the state of the souls they represent." Elena stared at him, her mind racing to grasp the enormity of his words. "Are you saying that every flower here is a person?" "Not a person, not entirely," Tormund said. "A soul is more than flesh and blood. It's memory, emotion, and essence. This field holds them, nurtures them, ensures they endure even when the body does not." Elena's gaze drifted back to the orchid. "And the black flower?" "It is a warning," he said grimly. "A soul teeters on the edge. If the bloom withers, the soul is lost." The weight of his words settled over her like a storm cloud. "Why haven't you told me this before?" "Because it wasn't your burden to bear," he said, his voice softening. "I am the Bloomkeeper, the guardian of this place. It is my duty to tend to the souls, to ensure their survival. And me? Elena asked. What am I to the garden? Tormund hesitated, the shadows in his eyes deepening. You are more than you know. The garden calls to you because you are its future. Elena's heart quickened. Its future? You are meant to take my place one day, he admitted. But not yet. The garden reveals itself in its own time, and the field beyond the gate is not for you until you are ready. His words only fueled her curiosity. The golden gate, the field, the hum that resonated in her chest, it all pointed to something far greater than she could yet understand. That night, Elena dreamt of the black orchid. It grew taller in her vision, its petals unfurling like wings. Around it, the other flowers dimmed, their vibrant colors fading into shadows. The hum of that garden turned discordant, a low, mournful wail that echoed in her ears. When she woke, the first rays of dawn spilled through her window. The hum was louder now, almost urgent, as if the garden itself was crying out for help. Elena rose, her resolve hardening. Whatever secrets her father was keeping, whatever truths the Golden Gate concealed, she knew one thing. She could no longer stand idly by. The garden needed her, and she would not let it fall into silence. The days turned heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Elena could feel the shift in the garden's rhythm. Its vibrant energy was faltering. Petals drooped and colors dimmed. Not from neglect, but from something deeper. A sickness that pulsed through the very soil. And the black orchid at the garden's edge, with its crimson veins, had begun to wither. Elena confronted her father again, her voice sharp with urgency. The garden is dying. You can feel it, can't you? Tormund stood by the rose trellis, his hands trembling as he adjusted a branch. He did not look at her. The field beyond the gate is in peril, he said finally, his voice hollow. And when the field is threatened, so too is the garden. Then let me help, she pleaded. Show me what's beyond the gate. You're not ready, Tormund replied, his tone edged with fear. I don't care if I'm ready, Elena snapped. This place is calling to me, and I can't ignore it. If the garden falls, I'll have failed it, and I can't live with that. Tormund turned to her at last. His face was worn, his eyes shadowed by the burden of too many years spent in solitude. It is not failure I fear for you, child, he said. It is the cost. But in the end he relented. At twilight they stood before the golden gate, its vines pulsing faintly as though sensing their presence. Tormund produced a key from around his neck, its shape intricate and jagged, as if it had been grown rather than forged. The gate creaked open, and Elena's breath caught as the field beyond unfurled before her. It was more beautiful than she could have imagined. A vast expanse of flowers stretched endlessly under the fading light, their colors shifting like liquid fire. Each bloom seemed to emit its own glow, and together they cast an ethereal radiance that defied the encroaching darkness. But the field was not untouched. At its edges, shadows gathered, curling like smoke over the blooms. Where the shadows lingered, the flowers blackened and crumbled into ash. "What's happening?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "The Veilbringers," Tormund said, his voice a low growl. "They are ancient forces, bound to the void. They feed on the ties between the souls and their blooms, unraveling the bonds that keep them whole." Elena's heart pounded. "Then we have to stop them." Tormund shook his head. "You don't understand their power. The Veilbringers are not easily defeated. The only thing that holds them back is the garden's light, and even that is weakening." As they spoke, one of the shadows detached from the swirling mass. It slithered across the field, its form twisting and shifting. Elena watched, horrified, as it reached a daisy, its petals trembling as though in fear. The shadow enveloped the flower, and in seconds, it withered to nothing. "No!" Elena shouted, rushing forward, but her father caught her arm. "You can't face them unprepared," he said, his voice desperate. "The field responds to its keeper, but you must learn to wield its power. If you rush in now, you'll only lose yourself." Elena wrenched her arm free, her anger burning brighter than her fear. "Then teach me. Show me how to fight for this place, or everything you've worked for will be destroyed." Tormund studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said, "but know this. To fight for the field is to surrender a part of yourself to it. Once you take on this burden, there is no turning back." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not afraid of sacrifice. The garden is worth it." Together, they knelt among the flowers, their hands pressed to the soil. Tormund began to chant, his voice weaving ancient words that vibrated through the earth. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the hum of the field grow stronger, its energy coursing through her veins. She saw flashes of light, colors too vivid to name, and heard the whispers of countless souls bound to the blooms. And then she felt it, a connection, deep and unbreakable. The garden wasn't just a place. It was alive, a collective of stories and lives woven together into something greater. And now, she was part of it. When Elena opened her eyes, her hands glowed faintly with a golden light. The flowers around her seemed to lean toward her, their colors brightening as if in recognition. She looked to her father, who gave her a grim nod. "The garden has accepted you," he said. "But this is only the beginning. The Veilbringers will not stop. You must be ready to face them." Elena stood, her resolve solidifying like steel. She turned her gaze towards the shadows encroaching on the field. "I will protect them," she said, "no matter what it takes." Night fell heavy over the field, its darkness thickened by the Veilbringers' presence. The stars above seemed dimmer, their light struggling against the encroaching void. Elena stood at the heart of the field, her fingers brushing against the petals of a golden marigold. The bloom responded to her touch, glowing faintly, as though drawing strength from her resolve. Tormund knelt nearby, his hands pressed against the soil as he whispered incantations into the earth. The field seemed to respond to him, trembling with faint vibrations. "The flowers will lend you their power," he said without looking up, "but you must let them guide you. Do not force it." Elena closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, tuning into the rhythm of the field. The hum was louder now, almost deafening, as if the souls within the flowers were crying out in unison. She could feel their fear, their desperation, and it mirrored her own. But beneath it all, there was a quiet strength, a determination to endure. Then she felt them, the shadows. The Veilbringers moved like smoke, amorphous and fluid. They emerged from the edges of the field, their forms dark as starless night. Though they had no eyes, Elena felt their gaze upon her, cold and unyielding. They spoke not in words, but in whispers, a chorus of voices that seeped into her mind. "Why resist?" they murmured. "All things fade, souls, blooms, even light itself. Surrender, and we shall take away your burden." Elena stepped forward, her fists clenched. "This field isn't just light, it's life. And life doesn't surrender." The Veilbringers shifted, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. One shadow detached from the rest and slithered toward her. It moved with an unnatural grace, its edges flickering like fire. Tormund shouted, "Stand your ground. The blooms will protect you if you let them." Elena braced herself as the shadow lunged. Instinctively, she reached out, her hands glowing with the golden light she had drawn from the garden. The energy burst forth like a shield, colliding with the shadow. It recoiled with a hiss, retreating into the mass of darkness. The garden around her responded to the battle. Flowers bloomed brighter, their colors flaring in defiance of the encroaching void. The hum grew into a resonant song, a symphony of souls united in their will to survive. But the Veilbringers were relentless. More shadows advanced, weaving through the field with terrifying speed. They touched blooms as they passed, and each flower they reached withered instantly, its light extinguished. Elena felt each loss like a dagger in her chest. She turned to her father. "What do we do? There are too many of them." Tormund's face was pale, his brow slick with sweat. "The Veilbringers thrive on despair. You must hold on to hope. The blooms need you to believe in them, to believe in what they stand for. That belief is their strength." Elena nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve. She knelt among the flowers, pressing her hands to the soil. "I'm here," she whispered. "I won't let you fade." The flowers around her began to glow brighter, their light merging with the golden energy in her hands. She could feel their essence flowing into her, a warmth that chased away the chill of the Veilbringers' whispers. When the shadows attacked again, Elena stood tall, her hands ablaze with light. She thrust them forward, sending arcs of energy into the darkness. The Veilbringers recoiled, their forms unraveling under the force of her defiance. "You will not take them," she shouted, her voice ringing through the field. The Veilbringers hesitated, their movements faltering. For the first time, Elena sensed uncertainty in them. They regrouped at the edge of the field, their whispers growing faint. But the battle was far from over. The largest shadow, a towering figure with edges that writhed like living fire, stepped forward. Its presence was suffocating, and even the brightest blooms seemed to dim in its wake. You cannot stop the inevitable, it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the earth. The bonds will break, the field will fall, and you, Bloomkeeper, will fade with it. Elena took a step forward, her hand still glowing with golden light. The field is more than flowers and souls. It's hope, it's memory, it's love. And as long as I stand, you'll never destroy that. The shadow lunged, its darkness swallowing the light around it. Elena met it head on, her energy colliding with its void. The clash sent a shockwave through the field, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the hum returned, louder and stronger than ever. The blooms flared with renewed brilliance, their light piercing through the darkness. The Veilbringer roared, its form fracturing under the onslaught. As the shadow dissolved into nothingness, the remaining Veilbringers recoiled, their forms flickering as if weakened by the loss of their leader. The field surged with light, each bloom shining like a star, their collective brilliance driving the shadows back to the edge of the field. The Veilbringers hesitated, their whispers faint now, almost pleading. Elena stood in the center of the field, her arms outstretched, the golden energy still flowing through her. She could feel the garden song resonating within her, a melody of unity and strength. "You will not return," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "The field is not yours to claim." The Veilbringers lingered for a moment longer, their forms wavering. Then, one by one, they vanished, dissolving into the night. The oppressive weight lifted, and the field exhaled, the hum settling into a peaceful rhythm once more. Elena fell to her knees, the golden light fading from her hands. Tormund was at her side in an instant, his expression a mix of relief and pride. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena looked around at the field, at the blooms that had survived and the empty spaces where others had fallen. "Not alone," she said. "The garden, its souls, they fought with me." Tormund nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "The field has accepted you, Elena. You are more than the Bloomkeeper's daughter now. You are the Bloomkeeper." Though exhaustion weighed heavily on her, Elena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had defended the field, but she also understood that this was not the end. The Veilbringers would return, their hunger for the souls unending. But for now, the garden was safe. Elena rose, brushing the soil from her hands. She turned to her father, her gaze steady. "Teach me everything," she said. "If I'm to protect this place, I need to know its every secret." Tormund smiled faintly, the shadows in his eyes lightening. "Then your true journey begins." The field hummed in agreement, its light twinkling like 1,000 unspoken promises. The garden, once a place of quiet hums and soft whispers, now sang with a chorus of light. The flowers swayed in a dance that was both joyous and mournful, their movements carrying the memory of victory and the shadow of what had been lost. Elena walked among them, her fingers trailing over petals that felt warm, alive. Each touch resonated with an echo of the souls she had sworn to protect. It had been days since the Veilbringers had retreated into the void, yet their absence felt as heavy as their presence. The garden bore the scars of their intrusion, patches of blackened earth where blooms once thrived, their places now eerily silent. Elena knelt by one such spot, her chest tightening at the sight. She pressed her hands to the soil, willing it to heal, but the hum beneath her fingertips was faint, fragile. Her father approached, his shadow stretching long in the golden light of the setting sun. "Not every wound can be mended," Tormund said gently. "Some losses remain, a reminder of what we fight to protect." Elena looked up at him, her gaze steady. "But the field endures," she said. "Even in its grief, it still sings." Tormund nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Yes, and it will always sing, so long as its keeper listens." In the days following the battle, Tormund had begun to share more of the garden's secrets. He spoke of the field's origins, how it was born from the union of light and life, a sanctuary for souls untethered by time. Each flower was a story, a memory, a life preserved in bloom, and each keeper was a guardian, chosen not by lineage, but by the field itself. "You are its heart now," Tormund told her. "The field recognizes your spirit. It will give you strength, but it will also take from you. To be the Bloomkeeper is to live for others, to carry their burdens as your own." Elena understood the weight of his words. She had felt the field's pull, its connection to her growing stronger with each passing day. At times, it was overwhelming, as if the whispers of 1,000 souls were pressing against her mind. But in those moments, she found solace in the garden's song, a melody of hope that steadied her. As night fell, Elena stood before the golden gate, its vines gleaming softly in the moonlight. Beyond it, the field stretched out in endless beauty, its blooms glowing like scattered stars. She closed her eyes and listened, the hum of the garden blending with the gentle rustle of the wind. Then she felt it, a faint disturbance, a tremor in the field's harmony. It was subtle, like a discordant note in a symphony, but it sent a chill through her. Elena opened her eyes and turned to her father, who had followed her to the gate. "They're not gone, are they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. Tormund shook his head. "The Veilbringers will always seek the field. They are bound to the void, and the field's light is a threat to their existence. This battle may be over, but the war is eternal." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then I'll be ready." Her father's expression softened, pride mingling with sadness. "You've grown into this role faster than I ever imagined. But you don't have to face it alone. The field is with you, and so am I, for as long as I'm able." Elena turned back to the field, its light reflecting in her eyes. She thought of the souls within it, each bloom a testament to a life lived, a memory cherished. She thought of the Veilbringers, their hunger to consume what they could not understand. And she thought of herself, the girl who had once been just a gardener's daughter, now a keeper of something far greater. As the moon rose higher, casting its silver glow over the field, Elena knelt before the gate. She pressed her hands to the earth, her voice rising in a soft chant, the words instinctive and ancient. The field responded, its light brightening, its song swelling with renewed strength. "I am the Bloomkeeper," she whispered, "and I will protect you always." The wind carried her words across the field, and for a moment it seemed as though the blooms bowed in gratitude. The hum of the garden deepened, not with sorrow, but with a quiet, enduring joy. It was a song of resilience, of life that refused to fade, and as Elena rose to her feet, the garden's light surrounded her, a promise that she would never stand alone.
you.